Students, hello and welcome. This is our third lecture on John Locke, and as promised, we shall resume from the point where we had left last time. Now, the consequence of studying power, as I said, is Locke theorizes power in a very different form. He says power is a kind of relation, and power belongs to a subject. It is not, an abstract entity or a substance that you could found. I mean, you could find anyway. This has immense consequence because when you say A is powerful, A has the power. For Locke, this is meaningful. But if you say here there is power and power is absent there, this is meaningless to Locke. This is especially significant because in later times of political thinking, for instance in Foucault, there power is not a relationship in the sense of power does not have an agent. Power is an abstract entity which is everywhere and at the same time nowhere. Now, what is the consequence of this thinking of Locke in terms of power? As we told, as you sort of also enumerated, power in terms of liberty and freedom. This is the trajectory which Locke follows. Now, what does it mean to say, power and freedom and trying to juxtapose power and freedom and explore something else? It is significant because Locke, by trying to explore power, free will and freedom, is trying to hold on to a very modern notion. This is the question of freedom. What distinguishes modern political thought from medieval or ancient political thought is the question of freedom or right. Okay? Now, what is free will? What is liberty? What is freedom? And how all of these are related to power? We've explored that extensively in our first two lectures, but I shall try to follow that up by posting, a kind of an additional supplementary note in order to rehearse that. Take, for instance, dreaming. Now, when we are dreaming, we are not free to choose dreams, We cannot switch from this dream to that dream. We cannot say that this is a nightmare and that's a sweet dream. I want to, go for that sweet dream. So, here, there is no free will. Free will basically is preference. But preference is not freedom. And Locke gives a very illuminating example. For instance, you might prefer, we all prefer, flying to walking, right? When there is a traffic jam in Calcutta or India or whatever, you would like to fly. But even if you would prefer to fly, you cannot will to fly, because if you try to will that, if you actually will, then you have to act on your will. You have to, act, you have to try, to fly. And you will fall down and you might die. So, there's a difference between preference, choice, and freedom. Now, the question is for Locke, from this question of freedom, the question of consent arises. In Locke, there's nothing besides consent. I mean, people come together in order to depart from the state of nature, because state of nature, there is no common power. If there is a dispute, if there is disagreement, if there is violence, they have to set up a common power. Okay. So they set up a common power. This, in Lockean language, is the commonwealth. Now, even if there is a commonwealth, now, what do? They sort of depart from the state of nature to the state of, civil society. That is fine. But still, and here is the main interesting, attractive part of Locke, where he tries to hold on and to project consent. Because then you set up a government, legislature and executive. He has a third part, federation, federatives, federal. But that is insignificant in terms of, Lockean trajectory. Now, you set up a government by consent. The government is supposed to govern you or rule you by consent. But what happens when, somebody is attacked? Say somebody wants to, murder you or kill you. What shall you do? What will you do? Locke says, you have the right of self-defense. I mean, if somebody wants to murder you, if somebody wants to steal your property, then you have the right of self-defense. In a sense, you can sort of, kill him in turn, right? Because there, you don't have the time to appeal to a common power. You don't have the power of law actually working at that moment of immediacy. You don't have the power of civil magistrate to regulate a dictum or a judgment over the thief or over the murderer. You have the right of, self-defense. Now, Locke makes this argument from and against the backdrop of consent. Stealing or murdering is somewhere that consent is violated. You cannot have the consent of, sort of kill somebody, to murder. But law has the power to kill. Law has the power not to steal, but to confiscate somebody's property, right? Now, because law has it, one might assume that law has the consent, of murder is something which is absolutely in violation of consent. But law has, as if law has our consent to, to kill, to execute the murderer. Now, if in India you try to address the huge debate on capital punishment, which is going on in the context of, many who have been hanged in recent times, a lot of terrorists or extremists or those who had killed VIPs or those who have committed heinous acts. These are the arguments which come up. That does the state, have the power to kill somebody, right? Because the state does not give life. Life is given by nature. In Lockean language, that's the state of nature, where you have life and, of course, in his terms, you have property too. Now, you set up the Commonwealth, set up a common power in order to mediate and, administer all kinds of, legal rules and bindings and sanctions. Fine. But then, this is the argument that when you have, when I consent to a government, consent to establishing or founding a government, I have already consented, to the actions of the government. When I've consented, when I've given up my right in order to come to a community, to a political community, or what Locke says, political society, then the political society or the government has the power. Fine? And this is specifically the problem which is addressed even in India today. Because the question of capital punishment here, the question of, giving death to somebody, is a crucial question which in Locke is formulated perhaps for the first time. Now, the question of consent here is problematic because, say for instance, when you go to vote, when elections are held, what governments, ruling coalitions ask from you is an express consent. When you are asked to say yes, raise your hand and say yes. That's an express consent you are offering, right? But Locke has a very dubious, ambiguous, and very problematic notion of tacit consent. What is tacit consent? Tacit consent is, kind of silent approval, silent consent. For instance, there is a discussion going on. Nobody is asking yes or no, but you are silent about it. It is assumed when you are silent, you have actually affirmed. You have said yes. So, when those representatives have assumed office through your help, through the operation or mechanism of voting, they have had your expressed consent, right? Now, because you have expressed your consent, the government will not go every time to the people or the community to renew this consent, say for every decision they take. It's not that, this week there'll be another voting, the next week there'll be a referendum. No. The question is, once they've assumed office, through express consent, you have to comply with the decisions they take. They can assume they have your tacit consent. Now this is dangerous because the question of tacit consent has been debated in feminist political theory as well as in Indian political theories today also. What is this? The question is, feminist political theory in India, they debate that this notion of tacit consent is dangerous, because when women, particularly women as a vulnerable, section of our community, their power to say yes or power to say no is constrained historically. In the absence or in the presence of such, historical constraints, their consent or the power to say no is somewhat limited. If they are silent, their silence is taken to stand for a tacit consent, as if they have said yes. In various court judgments, in Supreme Court, in various high courts throughout India, they have tried to battle the notion of tacit consent. That when women don't, when there is an absence of express consent from women, that does not mean that there is a tacit consent. So, as you see, Lockean political thought and the notion of tacit consent is working havoc even in India of 21st century, even in the year 2016. So, this is how Locke is influential and operative in India. Now, the question is, this notion of consent, as I told you, it is today it has become the benchmark of political thought in the West, even in India today. And not only in political theory, in all kinds of relational theory, ethics, sexual ethics, debates on, practical, everyday life. This is absolutely important register, but which was first posted by Locke in very important terms. There is another, point which Locke and the Lockean political thought was illustrative, and which had immense consequences in our context, because that for more than 200 years we were colonized. Now the argument for colonization was much, in fact, indebted to Locke and was borrowed from Lockean political thought in general. You remember that Locke is saying, for instance, in the state of nature, there is an equal liberty for all, right? Everybody has an equal right. Yes, but still, Locke has this illuminating example. If there is a fallow land, right, uncultivated land lying for 100 years, it is common to all. But you have 1 acre of land which you have cultivated, which you've used your own personal labor, then that is more productive than the fallow land lying with all of us. Okay? This is how Locke tries to, address and insert private property. Now, this question of property and this question of, using one's own labor to, address and to appropriate a particular, object of nature, land or whatever, fruit, whatever, has been significant in making colonies. What was that? Say, for instance, unexplored areas of land which was discovered by, say, Columbus, right? Any explorer, any discoverer, their argument was that this land lying in absolute savagery, right, in the state of nature, we have discovered this land. Now we have sort of, used our civilization to, insert, labor. We have tried to sort of mix that land and water resources with our own labor. We have given our brains. So, what we call colony or colonization is absolutely sanctioned in terms of, natural law. In terms of natural law, is absolutely okay, because these, according to their description, a savage, huge tract of land lying uncultivated. They don't recognize ancient or indigenous cultures, right? You have to have a modern civilization. Anything untouched by modern civilization, Africa or Asia, they discover, they go on, they introduce their structures, systematic structures, and they claim them as, they claim them as their rightful, colonies, but the colony is basically our term. They have a civilizing mission, and it's absolutely natural. I mean, in terms of this kind of theory which Locke had propounded, that any tract of nature, any product of nature, you put it to your own labor, you subject it to your own labor, and that is yours. Similarly, it could be claimed, a country could be claimed by another country. Okay? So, now you see that the history of our colonial subjection could be theorized, could be understood in terms of consequences of one notion of Locke. Right? Industrious labor. This is what Locke, theorized, that, anything natural is not for the unindustrious or those who, do not put their effort. Because everything is for those who are trying, those effortful, right? And basically civil society, or what you call commonwealth, the common power which Locke tries to, theorize. They intervene when there is a quarrel. Locke actually has some interesting, notations while he tries to, discuss this adjunct of quarrel. What is quarrel? That can be understood in terms of, Lockean, exegesis. What is that? Something from Locke tries to admit and tries to, suggest that when we are quarreling, we are actually asserting either more right or we have less of rights. When we are quarreling, we are asserting something which we shouldn't be asserting. We are trying to claim something more. And either we want to say more or we have less of. So it is a conflict between less and more. Who mediates these quarrels? The Commonwealth, civil magistrate, judge. And here, the role of the civil magistrate, the judge, or today what we say judiciary or law. The question of Lockean toleration actually comes here. In general discussions, you will find that Lockean political thought could be expounded in terms of 1, 2, 3 toleration. Where does toleration come from? Toleration actually, the question of toleration comes here, springs up here. See, Locke says that the civil magistrate, right, or the state or the government, they make laws, right, but they cannot administer our conscience. They cannot administer our conscience. So, in terms of a belief, suppose I believe in a particular God. You believe in a different God. Now, the civil magistrate cannot administer a law by which I could be persecuted for believing in this God. Locke wants to protect beliefs. Now, why does he want to do so? This is the question. Locke wants to do, not precisely because he believes in, a diversity of beliefs, or because there will be a multicultural society, there will be various cultures, various religions, as in India, so that they will be tolerated. This is not Locke's hunch. Locke's hunch is that church, basically, you can understand church in terms of a mosque or a temple also in India. This is a voluntary society, a voluntary association. I cannot be compelled to go to the church. If that is so, then the composition of a church is very different from the composition of a commonwealth or a state, what you call, where the institution of this state is not voluntary. It is rather compulsory. Now, the question is, a voluntary society cannot pass a judgment or cannot persecute people where there is no compulsion. Okay? In that sense, the Lockean principle of toleration is not specifically for the state to pursue. Here, today, we understand secularism as a principle of state. But for Locke, the principle of toleration is the principle of basic liberty by which the church will define itself. So, it is a question which is not specifically a political question. It is basically, fundamentally a religious, spiritual question where our conscience should be free. Now, this is very interesting, and while trying to address this, we shall go back to one of the basic registers of Lockean political thinking. Because as we said, Locke, even Hobbes, started with the question of how human nature is, how, our inner constitution is. And for Locke, specifically, Locke said that human beings are born not with any innate ideas, right? Our mind is a kind of blank slate. And slowly there are impressions, we try to develop knowledge and kind of stuff. But there is a problem here, you see. If that is so, if a child is, blank and empty in a sense, there are no previous impressions, or in our language, sanskaras, right? And we try to, develop a lot of ideas later, slowly, through the help of the senses and through the interaction of, senses and other people, internal, inner and outside world and kind of stuff. Fine. But if you say so, that there are no innate ideas, then the question of inner conscience becomes somewhat problematic. So, what it is to say that there is an inner conscience when you are denying that there are no innate ideas? This is the question. Because inner conscience is not something which you gain through impressions. Inner conscience is not something which you gain through interaction. Inner conscience is something which is not answerable to other people, to the state, society, whatever. Now this inner conscience is absolutely arbitrary, contingent. But Locke says that this arbitrary power, the question of, a deliberate nuisance in the name of inner conscience or whatever, is not acceptable to a public commonwealth. It can play in a church society, in a religious society, in a private society. But in a public forum where you have a lot of things at stake, your life, your property, the question of inner conscience is not really valid. There, the question of civil magistrate, standards, established laws have to take place. Okay? But the question is, the question of arbitrary, contingent and absolute power was disapproved by Locke. That we remember. He says specifically that monarchy, unlike Hobbes, is not suited to civil society. Because monarchy could be compared to also a form of slavery in which one has an absolute power over me. Okay? But can I give my power to somebody else to have that power over me? No. Because my person is my property. I cannot give it to somebody else. This is again a Lockean notion which defines modern political thinking, by which you can reject and absolutely reject forever the argument from slavery. Slavery is absolutely disapproved in modern political thought or modern thought, whatever, in modern civilization or a civic discourse, because it tries to grant somebody else power over somebody else's person. But that person is his own property. In fact, this is the argument when there is a rape trial. The rape victim is addressed in this term. It is not a question of consent only, but it is a violation of a person, because that person is his own property. The rapist has violated that term, okay? Violated the property in somebody else's person, okay? Now, lastly, as I told you, these are high-sounding, high-thinking words and notions, property, consent, government. We tried to address, love, friendship in those lectures on Hobbes, and I shall end up by addressing the notion of passion or love in Locke. Locke says, when, love is sometimes, natural, but we have to address love. Our object of love has to be chosen carefully. Our love cannot be given up to dogs and monkeys. In the sense, you have to be cautious in choosing the object of your love. That means, in politics, in terms of, Lockean political thought, when we depart with our own rights, when we give somebody power to administer certain things, we represent people. We have to choose our affection and cannot, give that power to administer us to political dogs or political monkeys. The point is, we have to be discriminative enough when we part with our rights, when we represent people and give them the power to take decisions on our behalf and administer, our present and future. We have to be cautious and give our love, affection to better dogs, better monkeys. In terms of Lockean political thought, it would be political dogs and political monkeys. Those who can, administer decisions in our favor. And, not as arbitrarily or as contingently as, people who try to theorize dogs and monkeys. Because they do have, as we told in the previous lectures, in terms of an animal ethics, they are neither arbitrary nor contingent. They have their own spirit. But when man, as a political animal, has to be cautious in distributing or disbursing their own loves. Thank you.